Hi, so this set of videos is going to look at the sort of equipment that you might consider bringing with you on your DofE. There's a couple of things to consider when looking at equipment. There's cost, effectiveness and pack weight. It can be really tempting when looking at, say, sleeping bags to think, I want the lightest one possible, but sometimes the lightest one might not be the best option for you. Often as well, cost can be an impact. If I have a very expensive sleeping bag and just use it once, that's not going to be cost effective. So looking to invest in equipment such as sleeping bags and sleeping mats is something you might need to think about well before you start your DofE journey. This video is going to look at the sleeping system, which is a sleeping mat that goes underneath you, as well as the sleeping bag, which covers you and goes around. There are options around using quilted duvets and these sorts of things, but this isn't an option we're going to look at today. We're going to specifically look at sleeping bags and sleeping mats. With me here, I've got two very different sleeping bags, but they both have a similar pack weight. On my left, I'm holding a winter down sleeping bag. This sleeping bag is designed to go down to about -10 degrees and is made out of down. On my right, I have a synthetic, more autumn or spring sleeping bag. This sleeping bag should keep you warm at about 5 to 7 degrees, which compared to your down sleeping bag is a lot warmer. So what are the pros and cons to each? First of all, your down sleeping bags. Down sleeping bags are really compressible, which means I can put it down into a much smaller size than, say, a synthetic bag. This is because it's made out of the down of a duck or goose, often an Arctic goose, when the bags are more expensive. This is a really great insulator and is what ducks and geese use to keep themselves warm in the winter. When a down sleeping bag's made, it's made with a ribbed lining which keeps the pile and the down together. As we compress it down, it becomes really small. As I take it out, however, within a few moments, a down sleeping bag is going to puff up really quickly. So a sleeping bag that might initially have been very small will start to puff up quite quickly. When looking at sleeping bags, we need to consider the rating that the sleeping bag comes with. This is normally a 1, 2, 3 or 4 season rating. This one's a 4 season bag. A 1 season rating means that it's probably appropriate to be used indoors. That means that it will keep you warm at about 15 to 20 degrees centigrade. A 2 season sleeping bag can be considered the sort of bag that you might take outside in the summer. So it'll keep you warm between 10 and 15 degrees centigrade. Then we start moving into more specific camping sleeping bags. So this one is a 3 season sleeping bag. On it, it tells me the season. So this says 2 to 3. And it also gives me something called the comfort rating. For smaller individuals, you need to take 2 to 3 degrees off the lowest estimate on a comfort rating. The comfort rating on this bag says it's 7 to 11 degrees centigrade. That means if you're a small individual, this might only keep you warm at that upper end or around 8 to 10 degrees. As well as your comfort rating, most sleeping bags come with what's called an extreme temperature. The extreme temperature isn't a temperature that you can sleep in. What most people think is that that's the sort of temperature that you might be able to use this sleeping bag in. The sleeping bag system rating, with its extreme temperature, gives you the extreme of which you might survive overnight. So looking at this extreme of -6 degrees makes me think, actually, if it's sub-zero, like it should be tonight, this sleeping bag might not let me survive. So you've really got to consider that when thinking about what sleeping bag you're using. As this is a synthetic bag, it isn't as compressible as a down sleeping bag. It's made up of the sort of pile lining you might get inside a quilted jacket or your duvet at home. Most sleeping bags come with a compression sack that can be really useful for making sure it becomes smaller. As I take out a synthetic sleeping bag, it's much less likely to get any bigger than the original size. I'm just going to zip this one back up. This sort of sleeping bag might only be appropriate for me to use whilst out in the summer. For me, I would prefer to use a 3 to 4 season sleeping bag in October all the way through to the spring in April. But you can use different methods to make these sleeping bags warmer. A sleeping bag liner, which can be made out of silk, cotton, or often out of a fleece, can be much warmer and is used inside of a sleeping bag. That keeps the sleeping bag from getting dirty and is also used to help insulate the bag when it gets cooler. Because this is a relatively slim and thin sleeping bag, I would expect it to keep me only warm in the warmest of temperatures. The advantage, however, with a synthetic sleeping bag is that if it gets wet, the sleeping bag itself isn't going to be compromised and it will still keep you warm. It'll last longer than a down sleeping bag because the pile lining is already compressed inside of it, whereas a down sleeping bag you can lose feathers through the fabric into the outside. Another advantage of a synthetic sleeping bag is these tend to cost a lot less than your down equivalents. So for £110 I might be able to buy a synthetic bag that'll keep me warm in 3 to 4 seasons. This bag cost about £30 to £40. Let's look at the disadvantages. So this 4-season sleeping bag was around the same size as the sleeping bag I just had out when packed away, and we know that it's much more compressible. The disadvantage with using down is cost. A down sleeping bag can cost up to 5 times as much as a synthetic sleeping bag. The big advantage is that it's much smaller for the same cost. The secondary disadvantage of a down sleeping bag is if this gets wet, it loses its thermal properties. So if this would be left outside in the rain, it wouldn't work for me to sleep overnight in. Disadvantages for your synthetic sleeping bags. So the disadvantage to synthetic sleeping bags are that they are much, much bigger when packed away, and it can be much harder to compress them and have a warm sleeping bag in a day sack or even in my expedition bag. Because they're much smaller for the warmth rating, this sleeping bag might take up to a third of my backpack. And for me, that means that this option isn't as good. However, on your DofE, if you can't find a way to keep your sleeping bag dry, a synthetic sleeping bag, for its cost effectiveness, and also the fact that it will maintain its warmth even when wet, is often a really good option. So we've had a little think about sleeping bags. Often some people will think, I've got a sleeping bag and this is going to keep me warm overnight. Unfortunately, you need to add to that another item, and this is always the sleeping mat. Sleeping mats come in around 3 different forms. That's a closed foam mat, which is made out of often foam or kind of small bubbles, a semi-inflatable and a fully inflatable mat. Your closed foam mats are by far the most cost effective. They'll help to keep insulated from the ground, but aren't particularly thick. When packed up, They're normally rolled. And even when rolled, this is still quite large. Comfort-wise, they're not particularly good. The thicker the mat, the better the comfort. This, however, costs about £10 to £15 and will keep someone warm on a bronze or silver expedition, and even be appropriate at times for a gold DofE expedition. The second option I have here is a semi-inflatable 3/4 length sleeping mat. So this sleeping mat is a 3/4 size, which keeps me warm from my bum to my head. Those are the serious vital parts that I want to keep warm overnight. I can use a series of clothes and also think about insulating myself with my bag if I want to keep my legs warm. The big advantage to a inflatable or semi-inflatable bag is its pack size. You also have the advantage of a much thicker mat, so these are often much more comfortable. I'd advise looking at a mat that is between 2.5 and 4 millimeters thick. A mat of that size is going to mean that it can be compressed down quite well and also allow us to have a really good, comfortable night's sleep. If space is a priority, like it might be for your gold DofE, think about using a 3/4 length. That'll keep my vital organs warm, but also it's going to prevent me from having too big a pack size. The advantage to these sorts of things are that they're both really well insulated and also have a fairly small pack size. The third option is a fully inflatable mat. For DofE, these can be really appropriate if you're using a tent on your own. The problem is if you're sharing, that if you end up getting a hole in it, you're sleeping on the floor. And on an expedition like a silver or gold expedition, this can mean that you're not able to stay warm enough overnight. So my advice would be to look at semi-inflatable sleeping mats that offer 2.5 to 3 millimeter thick rating. And I'd also look to ensure that you have something that's both affordable and going to keep you warm enough. If you choose not to have a sleeping mat at all, for DofE, you're choosing not to be properly prepared. It's a required piece of equipment to have a sleeping mat. That needs to be better than a yoga mat and at least the sort of thing that will keep you warm and slightly comfortable. As a minimal, I'd like to see things like the closed foam mats. These are both affordable and available from all outdoor shops. Next time, we'll have a little look at what we can do to keep ourselves warm and comfortable overnight.